Welcome everyone to the last panel of the Bucharest Forum. This panel has a title, UN 75 Years, Multilateralism and a Changing International Order, the Way Ahead. First of all, Secretary General of the United Nations, His Excellency Fabrizio Hochschild, will give an introduction of around 10 minutes. He is also the special advisor on the preparation for the commemoration of United Nations 75th anniversary. After that, we will have a panel discussion with Bram Bokshoorn, Director of the Netherlands Atlantic Association and Adjunct Faculty Lecturer of Webster University in Leiden. We'll have Nicolas Tenze, Chairman of the Center of Studies and Research on Political Decision for SEAP in Paris, and Ricardo Perisic, member of the Board of Directors of the Jacques Delors Institute. The United Nations, which is 75 years old, is no doubt the most successful global multilateral organization in human history. The first big attempt, the League of Nations, failed miserably after 15 years. However, United Nations is still there. We must admit that despite its success, that we have seen that multilateralism is under attack since a few years. And how of survival do we have from multilateralism? Or even, let's put it more mildly, how of multilateralism and perhaps more, can we do any reforms of United Nations that can make multilateralism better work? I give the floor to His Excellency Hochschild for an introduction of around 10 minutes. You have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry, we had a connectivity problem there. Look, at the outset, very warm greetings. I hope all those who are joining this session are well and safe and sound. And I'm very proud to be with such a distinguished and accomplished group of panelists, although it is a little strange in 2020 to be on an all-male panel. It looks a little 19th century to me. We just concluded the high-level week of the 75th session of the UN General Assembly. And on the 21st of September, about almost 120 heads of state gathered from around the world to take part virtually in marking the 75th anniversary. This is obviously a time of great upheaval, but beyond that, many feel that we're at a pivot point in history. The COVID-19 has accelerated us towards a fork in the road. And the big question of our times is, how are we going to deal with global challenges? Not just the global pandemic, but social inequalities, geopolitical tensions, the impact of digital technologies, and of course, the impact of climate change. Against this backdrop, 75 years on, international cooperation is more vital than ever. And on the 21st of September, many heads of state made reference to the centrality of the United Nations in dealing with global challenges. But this rhetoric notwithstanding, as the Secretary General pointed out, we have a surplus of multilateral challenges and a deficit of multilateral solutions. And we see at this time when multilateralism is more needed than ever, a retreat from multilateralism with a resurgence of superpower friction, a rise of isolationism, and generally also a broad sense of multilateralism fatigue, a sense that pursuing universal solutions is just too hard in the current international climate. But we have to acknowledge that part of what is nurturing this fatigue is also a sense that international cooperation, multilateralism, and the UN have not delivered. And we see that in the disenchantment with the Security Council, but also the broader inability of the international community to move forward with urgent challenges like climate change. So against this backdrop, I think there is a member state consensus that what we need is to rethink our global institutions and infuse them with new energy to overcome this dangerous paradox between rising global challenges and a diminishing will for international cooperation. And it was against that backdrop that the Secretary General launched a particular way of marking the 75th anniversary, not by any celebration, but by reaching out to peoples across the world under the banner of the future we want, the UN we need, and asking them, what are your fears and hopes for the future, and how can international cooperation be revived to better serve your aspirations, to better contain what you fear most in terms of global megatrends. And we also asked people about people's priorities post-COVID. We got feedback from well over 1 million people. We had thousands of dialogues across the world. And we also did independent polling through 2 very prominent international polling companies. The key findings are very striking. First, against the backdrop here in New York of polarization, friction, and disagreement, which characterizes interstate dialogue here, we found that again, in all regions, ages, age groups, and social groups, respondents were remarkably united in their priorities for the future and in their expectations of international cooperation. With regard to priorities post-COVID, unsurprisingly, the first priority was better access to healthcare, better access to water and sanitation, and education. But the second main demand, the second priority post-COVID, was more striking. People want to see more solidarity with the hardest hit communities, more solidarity with the hardest hit countries. And COVID also has highlighted for many 2 things: the problem of corruption across the world and the growing problem of inequality. And people want to see those challenges better addressed. With regard to long-term priorities, the overriding first priority was dealing better with climate change and containing the environmental destruction, which has been the price of the economic progress we've made over the past decades. With regard to international cooperation, 6 in 10 respondents said they feel the UN has made a difference in the world, and close to 80% believe that the UN is even more important in tackling the challenges ahead of us. And it's striking that especially among younger people and especially among women, and those are groups that, as this panel illustrates, are not usually given the voice they deserve, there is particular support for international cooperation. But people are not looking for more of the same. They are not saying the UN as it is wonderful. They are highly critical and they want change. They want a UN that better reflects the stakeholders of the 21st century, that is more diverse, that it brings in the voices of youth, that brings in the voices of women, that brings in the voices of underrepresented regions. And they also want a UN that is more impactful. So on the basis of these findings, the member states formulated a UN 75 declaration, which sets out many of the same priorities as those that emerged from our consultations, and called upon the Secretary General to come back with very concrete proposals to address the need for change. So the Secretary General will be consulting very broadly to come back with concrete suggestions to upgrade, improve, reinvigorate international cooperation and the UN in particular. So we've now begun the work of gathering ideas, and the change process still lies ahead. But we have to recall, and this came out very strongly from our consultations, for the UN to be credible, we have to understand that we are the UN and that the change begins with all of us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Hochschild, for this introduction. I would like to invite now Mr. Boxhorn for a comment of around 5 minutes, please. You have the floor.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Hochschild, for that perfect introduction. Actually, a couple of your remarks overlap with my introduction, so I can just skip part of that in order also to save time and move on. But let me just tie into the developments in the modern world system that you refer to as well, and the multilateral system that is under criticism from many sides. What I'm suggesting is that the world system is going into the direction of a bipolar world system with the US and China in the lead. It doesn't mean, of course, that the others are reduced to bystanders. It's not as black and white as that, but it's relevant for the what I'm suggesting as the a new task ahead for the United Nations and for all of us. So I think really that this bipolarity should be in the middle of our discussions. Given this direction, I think what could and should be expected from the UN in the coming years ahead is that the UN should not be involved in too many areas at the same time. My impression indeed is that the UN currently is sort of overstretched and has too much on its plate. So I suggest the UN should focus by executing pragmatic management and choose between issues that are solvable and are not solvable. And let me give you some examples of that. First of all, the reform of the Security Council. Well, this was set up in 1945 to regulate the relationship between the major powers. It's at this time it should be reformed, so that's crystal clear given the new global situation. But it's not going to happen. Libraries have been written on this issue, but so far nothing has come out of it. So I think we should forget about that. Also, peace enforcing missions, the heavy armed military interventions led by the UN, I think is something that is not for tomorrow. The UN is simply not equipped for that. So in my view, the UN then should devote its energy on a number of global issues, and I made three categories. First of all, development assistance. I think refugees policies, this is an area where the UN has proven to be very worthwhile. It has improved the lives of millions in this field, and I think this is something that should be continued. The second category on peace and security. First of all, an older task also, but very useful, the diplomatic conflict prevention should continue as before, together with peacekeeping missions, so to separate from peace enforcing missions. Peacekeeping missions have become incredibly more difficult, as we all know, but nevertheless, they remain very valuable. And the same goes for post-conflict peacekeeping and reconstruction, helping people who are in need of help. That's something the UN could really do under the UN flag. And then there is a third category, somewhat miscellaneous sort of category, with ambitions in the field of the sustainable development goals, but also protecting intellectual property. These are the issues I think that the UN should focus on. Again, as I said earlier, the UN is doing a lot and perhaps a little bit too much at the moment. And it's just as simple that you can't save the planet several times over. So that's my suggestion and my contribution to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boxhorn. I'll give the floor to Nicola Tenzer for your 4 or 5 I mean, it's your view on the future of the UN. Thank you.
Thank you, Kurt. The panelists, yes, I will just focus on 3 points, because I have to brief, I will be a little bit blunt, I must say. First, I think that you have to understand that we are witnessing right now the weakening of all the so-called generalist international organizations or political international organizations. In fact, what I mean by that is that there are two kinds of internationalization. You have, or within the international organization, you have, of course, two kinds of missions, which is technical missions. And I think that's the technical mission of those international organizations. I mean, development aid, refugees, which is also the development bank. So within these organizations, of course, are more relevant than ever. And when it comes to the regulations also, I think that these tasks are absolutely relevant. I think they are not truly endangered, with probably the exception of the WTO. I think they're very important. But when it comes to the political organizations, and that's for the UN, also for the OSCE, that's true to a certain point, even I think excellent move nowadays from the EU. I think we are something which is completely damaging in a way because there is common ground. You don't have common ground. I think all the political international organizations, you have, I know, a conflict of values, conflict of understanding, conflict perception of the values. And I think because of that, it's probably very difficult to restore the international organization as we know that. And my second point, which is completely related to that, is that in fact, if we consider you have two conflicting systems of values, we have especially one, whose goal is to undermine the international organizations, to make completely irrelevant the role of law, and to destroy the basic principles on which those international organizations lie, and of the values for which they are standing for. And especially if we consider, for instance, what Russia is doing. Russia is perpetrating war crimes in Syria. Russia is also China is blocking, and it did 14 times, all the UNSC resolution on Syria. And when you have one of the permanent member of the UN Security Council committing war crimes, and another one committing crimes against humanity and maybe genocide, you think, yeah, what's the relevance of this? And I think that's concretely the trouble that we are facing right now. We don't have to turn a blind eye to, I think, this breach of international law. What can we do? Of course, we can make some proposals. On my country, France, made some who are completely relevant. For instance, there could be no veto when mass crimes are committed. But we for sure know that most of the members of the Security Council will accept to comply with this proposal. So what can we do? And to come back to the questions that were already put by Secretary Madeleine Albright, saying, okay, multilateralism possible and unilateralism when needed. And I think the problem, and that's the point we are sitting now. What can we do? And especially when it comes to Syria, when it comes to Libya, when it comes to Myanmar, when it comes to Belarus, when it comes to Hong Kong, when it comes to Taiwan, what can we do? The UN is something, unfortunately, very unfortunately, cannot do anything. And we must not be fooled by the international arena. And of course, we could have the General Secretary, we could have member states, government, uttering nice words, but empty words when it comes especially to mass crimes committed in the 21st century. So I think the real issues that we have is, of course, to push forward as far as we can all the technical dimensions of the international organization when it comes to refugees, when it comes to some time peacekeeping mission, because they are still in some part of the world. But basically, very importantly, until we have this kind of powers trying to undermine the system, I think it would be very, very good, and even impossible to restore the system. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your critical contribution. I give now the floor to Ricardo Perisic. Please, your remarks.
Well, first of all, I'm very grateful for having been invited here. This is an important occasion and an important panel. My problem is that I agree with most of what Professor Boxhorn and Professor Tenzer said. So in addition to have a more diverse panel, you should have had more diverse opinions. We seem to agree a lot. Just a few remarks. First, we should not forget that institutionalized multilateralism, of which the United Nations are the prime, but not the only example, was the major contribution of the democracies that won the Second World War to the future of humanity. It's an exceptional value. Second remark, what is institutional multilateralism for? I can see two things. First is to avoid conflicts, and Professor Boxhorn went to great length in that. The second is to govern globalization. I don't see much purpose in multilateral institutions if there is no globalization. The cost of being provocative, I would strike a parallel between democracy and free markets. I'm convinced that democracy cannot survive without free markets. And at the same time, the future will tell us, the Chinese future will tell us if it is conceivable to have free markets without democracy. But that's probably a longer term problem. Now, that there is a problem and the weakening of the multilateral system is under the eyes of everybody. What is the reason? I don't believe that this type of problems can be cured by institutional reforms unless you handle the underlying political problem. There are two things. One is that the multilateral system, it can only work if participants are convinced that their sovereignty has a limit. Because multilateralism is something composed of sovereign countries. There is no way around it. But unless they are convinced that their sovereignty has limits, multilateralism cannot work. The second, and I think more difficult, and here I join, I think, at least the spirit of what Professor Tenzer said. The multilateral institutions have been the invention of Western democracies and imbued with Western values. They have survived the Cold War because the ideological divide was simple. Now we are a system with multiple values and principles, and it's much more difficult to govern, much more difficult to govern. At the same time, as it was inevitable, the governance of globalization proves to be much more difficult than expected. So the system will not be cured unless people accept that they have to put aside ideological differences and accept that this system is a marriage of necessity and not a marriage of choice. And what we have around the table are too many revisionist countries, people for whom the system is a zero-sum game. What they gain, somebody else would lose. The second is that the issues we'll have to address with high degree of humility. And I join Professor Boxhorn on that. Probably, before the international system can be revived, we shall need also a revival of regionalism, and that we can get back to some form of international system if regional cooperations such as Europe, the US, the transatlantic system can be consolidated. Thank you.
Thank you very much for three concise and provocative comments. I would like, if you to react to a few of the comments you get. I would like perhaps to put a question adding on this, being, aren't we not expecting too much from the United Nations? That they make the world entirely peaceful and that all diseases and poverty are gone. Perhaps goals that are just achievable, and as long as these goals are not achieved, that we will remain. So there was a question I would like to add to the comments that have been given.
No, look, first of all, I think many of these were really excellent points by my fellow panelists, and I do think we're going. We've shifted from a bipolar world order which characterized the UN for most of its existence with the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc to one from a dominance of one single power and its allies, and now we're moving. Some would say, as Professor Boxhorn suggested, to a new bipolar world order. Others would suggest to a multipolar world order, and that transition is very painful. And one could imagine, with all the uncertainties that transition brings, that there would be a stronger adherence to an international order. But of course, what we're seeing is quite the opposite. And I think the point is well taken that in that time, it does make sense for the UN to be more focused and to restrict the areas it tries to advance on. And I would also agree that Security Council reform and peace enforcement are areas where the UN promises to make a little progress. Coming back to your question, Kurt, I would, what are we expecting too much of the UN? I mean, Dag Hammarskjöld famously said the UN was not intended to bring us to heaven, but to prevent us descending into hell. And as Nicholas Tenzer highlighted, the UN has not always been successful in preventing peoples or regions descending into hell. But I would argue that without the UN, it would have been even worse. I mean, the main concern of the UN's founders was a third world war. And in fact, we're living the largest portion of history ever without a military confrontation of the major powers. So in that sense, the limited goal of preventing a third world war and a nuclear confrontation to date, touch wood, has been largely completed. And I think, there have been, over the course of the history of the UN, and not just recently, the most awful human rights abuses, from genocide in Rwanda and Cambodia to many abuses by virtually all powers. But I would argue that the building up of a framework of international norms and international human rights standards, the creation of international courts, the fostering of an international human rights movement, the increased scrutiny of the behavior of states, even if it has not been enough to prevent all abuses, I think we're better off than if those systems which the UN has contributed to did not exist. I do think, I personally, I understand why many perceive the UN as a sort of Western institution, but even if its founder was Franklin Roosevelt, and it was very much his and Churchill's initiative, I mean, at the outset, it came into being in a meeting of the four leaders, which included the leader of the then Soviet world, and of China. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted by an international panel of experts. And today, it's almost non-Western powers that are the most emphatic in their support for the institution. I was very struck on the 21st of September that the biggest words of support for our institution came, in fact, from smaller developing states, in particular small island states across the world. So I'm not sure that the perception that we're a Western institution is shared by all our members. I share the view that you can't revitalize the institution without political will. But I think the challenge is to foster that political will and make the point that greater internationalism and the ceding of sovereignty, or at least a tiny portion of it, as Professor Piersic assessed it, is a question of enlightened self-interest. I mean, we're more and more affected by global challenges that can only be dealt with through global solutions. And no matter how powerful, big, strong, rich a country is, they cannot deal with climate change alone. They cannot deal with the impact of new technologies alone. They cannot deal with growing global inequality on their own, let alone with the pandemic. So I think fostering the political will of course be key to accompany any institutional change. But I think that, especially among young people, there's an emerging sense that we need better global governance. And I think that the political will for that is at a low point now, but I think we all need to work together to make it rise.
Thank you. Professor Boxhorn, what you were actually proposing being, let's say, that the UN should more focus on a few, on a few fields in order to be active. Isn't that also something that people often propose towards the European Union, saying that the EU should more focus on a few and the countries will a bit more? But then, of course, always raises the question, from the moment something happens, like, for example, voices of a common approach, European approach, or for this matter, a UN approach, is always coming immediately to the surface. So how do you square that circle of people actually wanting things to be solved also on a global and multilateral manner?
Yes, part of your question, I couldn't hear it, but I think I can fill in what you were saying. You're absolutely right. It's in particular, the outcry of public opinion, in particular, if a crisis occurs, forces politicians, in particular, to act and to ask for strong measures, if necessary, on a supra or intergovernmental level. And that's, of course, one of the handicaps politicians have to live with. But again, if you, for the sake of arguments, if you limit the core tasks of organizations to a number of issues, then you can make it clear, what issues can be addressed by that particular organizations and what issues cannot be addressed by that particular organizations. And nowadays, I think you sometimes you expect too much, and sometimes too many issues are on the table that cannot be managed properly. And we've seen that on the level of the United Nations, but also, of course, referring to the European Union, it's the same issue time and again. That it seems that they are in full control, but it turns out they are not. That doesn't mean that I have complete answers for all these issues, of course, but I think in particular international organizations should be aware of its limitations, because if only for the issue of legitimacy, that at some point, the legitimacy of that particular organization disappears or starts eroding very quickly. And that's something that can be more harmful to organizations than anything else. Just to be sure, if the UN didn't exist today, we should here, as this panel, we should immediately found it, because it's very useful. There's no question about it. But that doesn't mean, it has to focus on all these many broad issues that it has, it's dealing with right now.
Okay, thank you, Nicola Tenzer. You complain, I think, very rightly on the bad role Russia is playing and on the fact to do that. Always the case. I mean, if only talking wasn't able to stop the invasion of Budapest in '56, not very far from here, or the war in Afghanistan, or I mean, other, let's say, wars that in Russia was involved in some way or another. So today, Libya and Syria, and I follow your indignation, and I would call to people to read your pieces, certainly about Syria and the outcry. You went to do something about it. I mean, has it ever worked, and will it ever work if one big country wants to be the bad player?
Oh, thank you, Kurt. Sorry, I didn't hear, all your questions are very bad, but well, I will try to answer on Russia. And first of all, to put this thing right, I think we must not accuse the UN for being important, of not willing to take action. What we have to take accountable for are only the states themselves, especially Russia and China. And on what I said before, there was absolutely no accusation to the UN as such. I think we have to put the thing right. Second, coming to your question, I think you're perfectly right. I think the real problem is that when you have big states like Russia or China or even Turkey who are committing either war crimes or foreign interventions or aggressions, etc. Basically, the UN system and the multilateral organizations at international level cannot do anything. That could be the role of regional organizations. But I must say that also when it comes, for instance, to NATO, which is that's another issue, I think that there is a true issue with the alliance itself, on the ground of the alliance, and of when it comes to military organization, of the true missions of the organization. Maybe it's time to revise also the Treaty of Washington. That's another story. But basically, I think that the solution when you have this kind of aggressions or war crimes or crimes against humanity committed by big powers, I think we must fight for regional or multi-unilateral solutions. But I think that the UN level is absolutely not ready and cannot do anything. But I agree with what Fabrizio Hochschild said before. I think we have really to congratulate the UN, to reward the UN for what the UN did in setting the rules. All the human rights resolution, all the general resolution also of RP, I think are the tools that we need right now. Unfortunately, the UN itself is not able to enforce, those tools. But the tools are the true weapons. For instance, I think we will have sadly to bring to International Criminal Court. We have to bring to the court people like Assad or Mr. Putin. Their right place is here. But unfortunately, with Russia and China being permanent members of the UN Security Council, we cannot do anything. But we have the legal tools, and thanks to the UN for that.
Okay, thank you. One more question for you, Mr. Perisic. You talk about the political will and the culture that is going down in order to go for multilateralism. But I mean, that we all see. The only question is if you have to wait for that in order to build a strong United Nations. I mean, maybe we have to wait for 20 years. I mean, it's not too long. I mean, shouldn't we build with those who want to go forward, something stronger than instead of waiting until everybody agrees?
No, I'm not sure that that is the right way to put the question, because the international system is the international system. We cannot legislate the existence of the international system away. The issues will be with us. I would put it differently. We have two types of potential conflicts. One is a conflict of interest, and the other is a conflict of values. I've enough experience of something like the European Union or the WTO to know that problems of interest can always be negotiated with the right political will. Values are not negotiable. That is the big problem. That is a big problem. We should, of course, continue to raise the flag of human rights with China, with Russia, even with Mr. Orban. But whatever we do, we shall not change China, we shall not change Russia. We may even have difficulties in changing Mr. Orban. There are three key words that will define international system in the next few years. One is cooperation, because the system needs some type of governance. There must be the conviction that cooperation is to some extent necessary. We must also have the conscience that it is limited, that the willingness to cooperate will be limited for some times. The second key word is competition. At the end of the day, we shall not change China, we shall not change Russia, but we have to prove, not with theories, but with facts, that our values are better. That is why it makes me mad to see that Asian countries seem to handle the epidemic better than we do. The third is deterrence, because when there are people who overstep, like Russia has done in Ukraine, like China is doing somewhere in the China Sea and in the Indo-Pacific, then we have to deter it. United Nations can play a role in some of these fields, but of course not all these fields.
Thank you very much. The sound is not everywhere, not always very good. Yes, you want to say something, Rochelle. I wanted to almost conclude, but please, yeah, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to. I'm afraid I have to move on to another meeting, but I wanted to thank you. I've taken very careful note, and the interventions of my fellow panelists have been very useful and very inspiring, and their perspectives highly appreciated. So I wanted to thank you, and with apologies for the rudeness of stepping out.
No problem. Thank you very much for being with us and for your very interesting and fascinating introduction and remarks. To the other three panelists, I would like to conclude with asking each one of you just for 1 minute, because to say something optimistic about multilateralism in the world today. This is the last panel of the week of Bucharest Forum panels. And well, the situation in the world is rather depressing. So why not trying to end with a positive note before everyone can go and start the weekend, whether or not with a good glass of wine. Mr. Tenzer.
Okay, thank you. So we were talking about human rights and about universal values. I think the good news is that those values are truly universal. Because when we see people taking to the street in Hong Kong, in Moscow, in Minsk, in Algiers, in Khartoum, etc., we'll see that even people who have read the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, Spinoza, Locke, Descartes, Kant, Rousseau, etc., those people are basically gathered, they are united by the same values. So I think from this point of view, there is no, Westernalism of those values. They are true, this is a kind of practical, very concrete universalism, because those values lies in the heart of each people, whatever their society. We have to be optimistic.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Perisic, in the final 1 minute optimistic note.
Yeah. Well, first, I sympathize with Professor Tenzer. I am convinced that our values are the best. I am not convinced that they are universal. Anyway, to say something optimistic, being a realist, I think that the most optimistic thing to say is that you can only drop out of the multilateral system at great cost. Boris Johnson is discovering that while trying to leave the EU. The important thing is that when people want to drop out of the system or to violate the rules, we must make them pay a price. That is the best incentive that there exists to keep multilateralism alive.
Okay, thank you very much. And let's finish with Professor Boxhorn, your 1 minute of hope and optimism.
Well, what can I add to all these wise words that have been spoken already? Let me conclude by saying that I don't think there is in any respect a contradiction between the interest of the nation state and multilateral cooperation. I think both things go together very well. And I think there is enough ample historical proof for that. So there is, let's continue with that. That would be my optimistic end message for this panel.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone, for following this panel and all the panels of the last week. I wish you, I think, in the name of the 4 panelists of today and myself, of course, a great end of the week, and I hope that at least this panel as well has given you something to think about, and at the end something to be hopeful about. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.